Very pleased to meet you. My name is Nick Veringmeijer from Biomapas, and I'll be doing the introduction, after which I will introduce today's experts, to which you can direct your questions. But first, we've prepared a short overview, which you can also find on our website in an article form to read about the impact that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine will have on the pharmaceutical industry. So if you have 1 second, I will share my screen with you for the presentation. Here we go. So leading up to today's webinar, we got a lot of questions already, with the main one actually being, if we filter it, what impact can we expect from the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Starting out, we'd like to say, even though this is, of course, not a political webinar, we would like to mention that we do condone this war of the Russian military activity in Ukraine, and we do not approve. That being said, I think one concern that we all have as pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, the solution providers like us, the clinical research organizations around it, we have a goal to save patients' lives, that either being existing patients or war casualties. And to do so, we need to guarantee access to treatments. Well, that process is being, that's very difficult to sustain currently in actually both Russia and Ukraine. So we created an overview of the knowledge that we currently have of what's happening, ranging from investments that will impact the future to current impact that might be on the areas of expertise like pharmacovigilance, clinical research, and regulatory affairs, and of course, quality. So if we start out, there are already healthcare measures in Ukraine, the ones that you've seen in the news most likely. So those would be pleas for voluntary personnel, assistance, of course, from foreign nations to Ukraine in response to this situation. What was seen predictably at first, of course, a high demand for first aid supplies like band-aids, painkillers, blood donations. We're now also seeing a depletion of available crucial medication for patients. It's mostly due to, obviously a broken logistical network due to the war. Well, later on, my quality assurance manager colleague will also reference to some of these involved parties with official documentation that has been released, mostly stemming from, for instance, the Ukrainian Ministry of Health, the Association of Pharmacy Professionals in Ukraine, and of course, the World Health Organization. But the question now is how this will evolve if combat continues in the long term. Well, for that, let's start out with looking really at the future. One interesting thing that's already happened is that the CEOs and top-level executives of some very prominent pharmaceutical and biotech companies, they signed a letter, which you can find online. It's written in multiple languages, and when it's not a few CEOs or top-level executives, currently it's hundreds, referring to this invasion of Ukraine as a barbaric act. And basically what this entire letter does is calling to their peers, so either venture capital firms or large pharmaceuticals, to cease and desist their future investments and basically economically disengage from the Russian industry. So it will definitely have its effect on the long term. But then, of course, we'll also see short-term effects. So one area that we're very familiar with, because Biomapas has been active in the CIS region, Russia, Ukraine, and the countries surrounding it for the past 20 years. And at the very least, you can expect hinder trials in both Russia and Ukraine. Sponsors there will be looking to relocate to other parts of Europe for their, maybe to pick up their current trials or new trials to start them. And this will be the case for the foreseeable future. And eventually, although we can't tell, we do know for one thing that the effect of the conflict on the clinical trial landscape is going to be far-reaching in both Ukraine and Russia. So one of the main questions we already received is how to proceed with clinical trials in Russia. First and foremost, we would advise everyone logically to focus on your local employees, their families, to support them and, see to their needs, either technologically, emotionally, financially, logistically, wherever you can. we put together some things of not to expect and some things you can definitely expect. So don't expect to start any new trials or engage in new regulatory submissions or even conduct patient screening or be involved in any new enrollment activities in these countries. I do expect that some or maybe all clinical trial subjects, they can be discontinued, and expect that internally you will have to assess the impact it will have on your global clinical trial programs based on these individual trials in the countries. And always keep an ongoing conversation with your stakeholders, because every situation is unique, and only by keeping this open conversation can you make informed decisions later on. Regarding this, my colleague will also explain a bit more about Ukraine's State Expert Center, which offered for the Ukraine situation some clear recommendations. It can be found on their website, and if you let us know, we can send you the link as well later on after the webinar. Then, of course, on the other side of the border, how to proceed with clinical trials in Russia. In this case, perhaps less to say, but that you need to assess projects in a risk-based approach for your active sites. Policy site activations, including screening and enrollment. Again, perform risk assessment for the individual sites with the engaged stakeholders there. Above all, as always, as my pharmacovigilance colleague will definitely support, prioritize patient safety above all. Monitor the situation and always ensure proper governance to escalate any situation that might occur. And all of this basically with the main advice to make sure that you enable yourself to make an informed decision in these areas. So then, following the changes and the current situation, we got the question, how do we adapt? How do we adapt to a new landscape for clinical trials in Europe? Well, for now, it seems that Central Eastern Europe within the EU or the other yet uninvolved CIS countries are probably the best short-term option, while waiting for resolution and restart in, well, we don't know when that will be, but for new trials in Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine. Then later on, for pharmacovigilance, it might not be that very first thing we think of, but patient safety is something that we need to guarantee. It's a legal obligation that we have. Of course, in a conflict like these, we can make guarantees, but what we can is try our most and to the possible extent to keep assessing risk where you have operational gaps in your drug safety programs. Practical things like ensuring the management of your pharmacovigilance inbox, and make sure that you're trying to be as consistent as you can in safety monitoring. Then, from a regulatory perspective, until now, the drug registrations in both countries, they remain unaffected. But as mentioned before, you will see that there will be limited activities at local authorities, especially in Ukraine, of course. But on both sides, there will be delays in procedures. For instance, an example, because of the sanctions and the hottification of, the financial transport, there will be issues with state fees. And then the main question we got a lot, what about the Eurasian Economic Union's plans for a uniform pharmaceutical market in this area? We can't make any statements about that yet, of course, but it's unimaginable that a conflict of this size will not impact those plans. If you would like to learn more about it, simply visit our website or Google drug registration in the EAEU to find more about this procedure and how that might possibly be affected. Then, of course, we have Ukraine, which is a sad situation, but still also, for those of you on the Russian market with a product, we can't focus solely for business continuity on Ukraine. The Russian market used to be a favorite country to expand into. And if you have products there, or we're planning to, keep in mind that from now on, they will be dealing professionally and personally, perhaps, with a tainted international reputation, and that these sanctions will be hugely detrimental to the entire life sciences landscape there. So that being said, I hope this gives you some brief insights into the current situation. And of course, we promoted the webinar as a question and answer, which we'll get to after the slides by our colleague from Quality. So today's experts, we try to balance, of course. So we have our Chief Global Clinical Research Officer, Regina Oscanine, Head of Global Pharmacovigilance, Martijn van der Leur, and our Quality Assurance Manager, Solene Kudaraskete. And they will do their utmost best to answer any questions you may have. We already got some emails as well with questions, and please do feel free to shoot any questions at us, and we will try to answer them to the best of our ability. And then now I give the word to Solene.
Thank you, Nick, for introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to provide a brief overview of any regulatory updates and clinical research activities in Ukraine, in the Russian Federation and Belarus, after Russian Federation has started military aggression in Ukraine, and some practical recommendations from different governmental bodies or associations, as Nick has already outlined. So for Ukraine, we have very concise recommendations issued by competent authority, specifically by the State Expert Center of Ministry of Health of Ukraine. Initially, these recommendations were issued in the beginning of March and updated on 14th of March. And also Ukrainian Association of Clinical Research has posted their statement on their Facebook. For Russian Federation, I could not locate any official recommendations or regulatory updates by Ministry of Health to the current date. There are recommendations by Association of Clinical Trials Organizations, ACTO. These recommendations for clinical trials were issued on the 5th of March. For Belarus, again, no official recommendations by competent authority, at least I could not locate in their official webpage. And by the end, I will provide you a brief overview of international ethical guidelines issued by the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, SCIOMS, for clinical trial during disasters. So for Ukraine, we have very pretty concise recommendations issued by State Expert Center for clinical regarding conduct of clinical trials under circumstances of military aggression and martial law. The sponsors should critically evaluate the feasibility to initiate new clinical trial. They should halt activation of new clinical trials or activation of new trial sites, or including new subjects in already ongoing studies. ZEC has issued the following recommendations for trial sites. In case of restriction of movement of subjects, consider the following measures where it is possible, of course. Replacement of physical trial visits to telephone contacts or video visits with these study subjects. Also postpone or cancel of visits if necessary. In case it is not possible to obtain written informed consent, the study participant may give an oral consent in the presence of impartial witness, who also signs the informed consent form. In such cases, the investigator should indicate in the source documentation how the impartial witness was selected. And in addition, there may be a situation where the subject and the person receiving the consent signed and date separate forms of informed consent. This is the most possible situation. And in any case, all relevant records should be available of such procedure in subject file or investigator file. And afterwards, when it becomes available, possible, the subject should receive the informed consent, fully signed and dated as in usual way. So regarding investigational products, it is recommended to take all possible measures to ensure the uninterrupted provision of IMP to the subjects and compliance to protocol, whatever is possible to ensure subject safety under such conditions of martial law. Also, alternative laboratories of other healthcare facilities may be used if it is necessary to take subject samples. Recommendations for already going trials. If it is not possible to continue conducting the clinical trial in the approved clinical trial site, the subjects may be withdrawn from the trial, or if possible, the subjects may be transferred to other approved trial sites within Ukraine, or as it is absolutely understandable that it is difficult to ensure subjects' rights, safety, and health under current conditions. In case of subjects departed to other countries, a possibility of temporary transfer of such subjects could be considered if the same trial is ongoing in the hosting country, and if the same trial is approved and involved. Any kind of such transfers should be reported to competent authorities, specifically to State Expert Center, and also to local ethics committee of the institutions at the first possibility. What are recommendations for CROs? In certain cases, for example, in particular, if COVID clinical trials, or if any clinical trial is at the stage of interim or final database lock, a remote source data verification, SDV, is possible. Any actions of investigators in connection with the conditions of military aggression should be agreed with the sponsor. Sponsor should be kept informed on any changes within the trial site or study conduct. If necessary, a substantial amendment should be submitted to the Ministry of Health and the relevant local ethics committees, and also approval should be received by competent authorities. All cases of protocol violation related to subject safety and other aspects of clinical trial should be reported to competent authority by email provided here, and original documents may be provided later if possible and if necessary. Also, notices to local ethics committees should be provided by email, and a general recommendation by State Expert Center that conduct of any planned clinical trial audits is currently halted. So really, I would say these very brief, concise recommendations issued by Ministry of Health of Ukraine are really practical guidelines how to proceed with clinical trials under military aggression in Ukraine. Also, we have a position statement to all pharma companies issued by the president of Ukrainian Association for Clinical Research with a request to stop any operation activities of pharma companies in Russia. For Russian Federation, as I mentioned before, I could not locate any official Minzdrav recommendations or any regulatory updates regarding clinical trial conducts in Russia. And we have a position statement issued by Association of Clinical Trials Organization in Russia, how clinical trials should be conducted under sanctions and restrictions, and of course, under increased significant risks and the high degree of uncertainty we have currently in Russian Federation for clinical trial conduct. So anyway, ACTA calls to focus on the principles of Helsinki Declaration and the ICGCP standards. And first of all, the care should be taken of subject health, welfare, and of course, the rights of these trial subjects. What are the recommendations? They recommend to postpone launching any new projects, opening new sites, or enrolling patients in trials. Also, amendments to protocol concerning patient safety should be considered if necessary. Any deviations from the protocol should be properly recorded. Due to logistic problems and limitations, there should be considered a switch to available laboratories for taking study samples, or anyway, postponing collection of study samples may be considered. For IMP logistics, also new routes should be arranged for IMP, for lab kits transportation or equipment supply. Also, direct IMP delivery to the subjects may be arranged. Also, alternative communication channels should be thought, especially, for example, if any internet restrictions or bans are coming, so maybe fax machines, going back to fax machines. So these are very common recommendations issued by Russian Association of Clinical Trial Organizations. And by then, just a quick reminder on international ethical guidelines issued by the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, SCIOMS, which is an international non-governmental organization which has official relationship with the World Health Organization. This was the fourth version of SCIOMS guidelines issued in 2016, but nevertheless, we're referring to these guidelines as there is a special dedicated section to the research in disasters and disease outbreaks from events such as earthquakes, tsunamis, or military conflicts, as we have nowadays in Ukraine. And they outline that the first and foremost obligation in acute disaster situation is to respond to the needs of those who are affected. And these two obligations to proceed conducting clinical trials and to meet healthcare needs may come into conflict because humanitarian response and the health-related research activities often rely on the same infrastructure and the same personnel. SCIOMS has outlined some general challenges in disaster research. First of all, researchers as well as study subjects are at physical harm, and also we have limited or damaged health infrastructures, as we can see today very evidently when hospitals are shelled by Russian army. Also, researchers and sponsors should uphold the ethical principles, even if the standard ways of respecting these principles may need to be modified. An acute disaster situation can require modifying these principles so that ethical principles can be upheld in the most expedient way what is possible. For example, why ethical oversight is essential in clinical research. Any kind of accelerated ethical review during disasters may be necessary. And just again, example from Ukraine, I've checked their webpage, official webpage, and they resumed the work of one window principle. Still, any questions may be submitted even on site or online via email. So Ministry of Health of Ukraine still keeping contact and communication with clinical trial sponsors and organizations. So in a bottom line, carrying clinical trials under disaster situation, as currently we have nowadays in Ukraine due to Russian military aggression, is indeed an enormous challenge. Nevertheless, the safety health of trial subjects, as well of trial site employees and clinical research organization employees in the affected countries, is the top priority. So that's it, what I would like to share with you today. I'm giving the word back to Nick. Nick, you are still muted.
Yes, I see that I'm muted. So I was thanking you for the clear overview. And then from this moment, we're going to open the floor for some questions. So again, here we have experts from clinical research, Regina, pharmacovigilance, Martijn, and then Selene for quality/regulatory. And if you use the Q&A option, you can send your questions to us. And then of course, we'll start answering those. And there's actually already a first question. It's for pharmacovigilance. So should pharmacovigilance obligations continue during war? What's reasonable? Martijn?
Yeah, it's a very obvious first question that we asked ourselves as well for our department. We have staff in Ukraine. We have pharmacovigilance operations there, of course. The first response is yes, of course, but to what extent? You know, as far as you can. People who know pharmacovigilance a bit, they know that business continuity is always a big thing. You know, you get questions in inspection, show me your SOP on that, and show me how you can continue operations under any circumstances. I'm pretty sure that for all of you and your companies, these SOPs don't describe what exactly to do during a war. You know, you do your best, and you can try to do some practical things. I think the first that all companies should do is take care of their own employees in the country. At least that's what we did. Make sure that they are safe, that we can support them as much as we can. Secondly, what are practical things that you could do? Simply, I think Nick mentioned in the beginning, the management of a safety inbox. Many companies have one central inbox. If that's the one for Ukraine, I spoke with the head of safety. They had, by coincidence, this mailbox shared with another country. So they immediately instructed that other country, like whatever comes in that seems Ukrainian, pass it on to headquarters, we'll make it translated and see if we need to do something with it. So these are little practical things you can do. And yeah, if the question was what is expected, you can think maybe there are other priorities in the country at that point in time, but I would say just do what you can.
Okay, thank you for that, Martijn. Regina, we have one for you. I'm not really sure. So the question is, suppose you have a clinical trial running in a yet unaffected area in Ukraine. What would be steps to take currently?
So maybe I will broaden the question. Definitely, we have clinical trials that we are monitoring as biomappers in Ukraine. But it's important to remind, we've just started talking about countries which are clearly in conflict, Russia and Ukraine. But of course, we, as Selene already mentioned, we are also talking about the Belarus, which is accomplice to Russia, and also this is a subject to certain sanctions. And of course, we are observing and evaluating the situation overall in the complexity for the impact on clinical trials in this region. So looking at the overall impact, if you look at the clinicaltrials.gov, there are more than 250 active clinical trials in Ukraine, with the sites in Ukraine, and usually there is not just, we're not talking about 2-3 sites in this big country, we're talking about many sites. If we look at Russia for clinicaltrials.gov, this is more than 550 active clinical trials which have sites in Russia. And if we look at Belarus, this is more than 39 registered clinical trials with the sites in Belarus. So impact of the war is really tremendous, and of course we need to think about that we have over 3 million people who had to flee Ukraine because of the conflict, and many of them might be subjects of, might be patients of the clinical trials. So thinking about the patients, of course, we have to make sure that patient safety is first, so that they are alive and safe, and to make sure that of course they keep the contact with their investigators. But we know, as already Solana mentioned, that we, with the clinical trials, we are relying on the same healthcare structure for the regular healthcare, for the clinical trials, and currently, by no means we can call this is a regular healthcare, because we have many hospitals, outpatient clinics being destroyed severely, and we also have to keep in mind that this the healthcare was severely impacted by COVID pandemic, and they still didn't manage to recover from this overburden. So currently, this is very difficult to talk about the continuity of the clinical trials when the whole infrastructure is physically harmed and clearly overburdened, and we have many injured patients coming in, and of course, clearly those patients in Ukraine will be the top priority. So, and again, we have to keep in mind about the patient population, which used to be enrolled in clinical trials in this region. Usually, this was Ukraine and Russia and also Belarus, partly because this smaller country was very popular, let's say, for among the sponsors, because usually this is high recruiting. Those are high recruiting countries. We have the population where the patients are really highly motivated to enter into the clinical trial, because for many of them, this is probably the only source to really be able to get to really modern treatments. And most of the current active clinical trials are in such indications as oncology, schizophrenia, inflammational bowel diseases. So we can imagine that those patients are really severe, well, really sick, and they definitely need medical attention. So that's a huge impact on those patients. And talking about sponsor side, our clients that we are working with as a service provider, it's as we know that data integrity, data consistency is key in the clinical trial, and we are currently losing that in Ukraine especially. And when patients will be hopefully coming back to the clinical trials, indeed they will be clearly coming back to the new country probably, and to the new clinical trial probably, because the situation has changed so dramatically. So by all means, the sites and clinical trial colleagues, of course, will be making all the efforts to make sure that clinical trial data integrity is saved, but that's going to be really challenging, because locally people, of course, doctors are trying to keep in touch, even if the patients have relocated to other countries like Poland or Moldova or Romania. So that is very important. And sponsors will, of course, feel tremendous harm, because there were quite a few clinical trials which were approaching the end, let's say phase 3 clinical trials, which were approaching the registration. And they had some quite significant number of the patients enrolled in Ukraine, like 15 or 20% of this population. So this would mean that their data is basically might be well wasted, and money might be wasted. So anyway, currently we are focusing, as we know, situation is really changing day by day, and we are currently focusing first of all on the patient safety, to make sure that they are safe, and we can, and investigators can keep the connection with the patients, and as according to possibilities, to make sure that they can run even remote visits and keep in touch. Our staff, our monitors are trying to be in constant connection with our investigators. And we are trying to be in constant connection with our sponsors to make sure that they are aware of what we are doing and how the situation is changing and what is our action plan. And of course, not to forget that we take care about our staff as well, who are also fleeing the country and they are not able to conduct their duties as they used to be. Yeah. So I think that's yeah, not a short version of answer.
Okay, thank you, Regina. I hope that answers the question. Now I'm going to continue with a long question, I think, for Selena. How should Ukrainian SEC LECs be informed regarding patient transfer in a clinical trial to other countries? How should regulatory authority or ethics committee in country to which patient has been transferred to be informed? For example, would a cover letter be sufficient?
Mm-hmm. First of all, regarding Ukrainian ZEC and LEC, ZEC has provided, in their recommendation, we can see that letters, notifications could be emailed to ZEC, and I can provide you the link to these recommendations, and you can find email address. So probably just initial information by email is sufficient, provided to ZEC, and afterwards original documents may be provided when it is possible, after situation allows to do this. Also, LEC should be maybe contacted by email as well, according to Ukrainian recommendation. Regarding to the hosting country, I'm just thinking about general principles of GCP. Again, this kind of transfer, hosting country should be informed accordingly. Both competent authority and ethics committee, whatever is central or local. So I believe local startup people in the hosting country would help with this, how the hosting country should be informed about these transferred subjects. But I believe they also should be informed accordingly. So I will provide the link to these ZEC recommendations of Ukrainian Ministry of Health, and you will find their concise information.
Okay, thank you. I think your question also sparked another quick question, which I can probably answer. Can you share a list of available documentation later on?
Yes, I will.
We can do that, right?
Yeah.
And then a question for Regina. What are other countries in the region with high recruiting potential to add in the trial, which has been started in Ukraine and the Russian Federation? Thank you.
Nick, can you repeat what are other countries where we can start?
Yes. What are other countries in the region with high recruiting potential to add in the trial, which started in Ukraine and the Russian Federation? Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for a good question. So currently what we are discussing in Biomappers, we have very well established clinical trials and wonderful talented team in Georgia. And this is a really great high recruiting country. And we are considering to see if this is possible to transition or to save some clinical trials, the number of the sites and the number of planned subjects using sites in Georgia, and definitely this is going on very well. So that's potentially, and well, it's not about the recruitment potential, it's also about access to the treatment. This is very easily comparable to the previous situation in terms of recruitment potential to Ukraine that we had earlier. And this country is also famous with about the short startup timelines, so really huge potential for Georgia. And the other country which in this region which we are focusing on, and we already established the office and operations is Kazakhstan. It's also a huge country with huge potential. We are initiating soon several sites in inflammational bowel disease indication, but I believe this is a huge potential also for this country. So our first thoughts are around those two countries, and of course to explore more potential, looking at, of course, Central and Eastern Europe.
Okay, thank you. Clear answer, I think. Then one for Martijn, a tricky one. How about risk management for medication supplied as humanitarian aid in Ukraine?
Yeah, I saw that one coming in, and while the others were speaking, I was thinking the whole time of a good example of something to consider here. I'm careful that I shouldn't make this sound like too funny, but I had to think of what people are doing in my local Greek restaurant. I live in the Netherlands, in a small town, and we have a Greek restaurant, very friendly people. They start collecting goods for Ukraine. So they're driving nonstop to the Ukrainian border to bring stuff and bring refugees back. What they bring, part of it, what they're asking for is medicine. So they ask basically citizens in my town to bring medicine to the Greek restaurant and ship it over to Ukraine. I think that is an example of where we should be careful that we don't get too enthusiastic and bring in whatever we think could be useful, because they make great food, but they are not medical doctors, I'm pretty sure. So the question is, yes, we want to help with whatever we can, but can we do that still in a kind of controlled way? I wouldn't like to think what happens if, let's say, falsified medicine is shipped intentionally or not across the border, or simply the waste of goods. If a lot of medicine is just basically thrown over the border, like here, good luck, but people don't know how to use it, or it's the wrong formulation, or expired. I don't know. So what I would say is, in terms of risk management, let's try and keep following as good as we can the international rules for how you distribute medicine to a country, ideally through, let's say, pharmaceutical companies themselves or large international health organizations who can coordinate this.
Okay, thank you. Then answer the next one. I think there's you guys will be here for a bit. The question is, can we expect the supply of approved medicines to Russia to be impacted? And also, do we have any info on if any pharma company already stopped with the supply? Who will answer the question? Do we know?
Sorry, Nick, could you repeat it once more?
Yeah. Can we expect the supply of approved medicines to Russia to be impacted? And also, do you have any info if any pharma companies stopped with this supply already? So basically,
okay. Well, I
will stop.
I can start because I had some discussions with people from pharma companies. I was curious if they were planning, for example, to withdraw registrations already, or any other rigorous plans. I think, first of all, the truth is that many big companies are observing what's happening, not completely sure what to do. First of all, if you look at it commercially, whatever you think of the situation, big companies will be hesitant to withdraw their registrations. It would take a long time to get it back. Meanwhile, they would lose their position in a country. Whatever you think of Russia, that is not what will happen on short notice. And that means also a lot of obligations will need to continue. If you talk about pharmacovigilance, even if there's not a single adverse event reported, you still have obligations as long as the registration is there. But the second thing I'm thinking of is an ethical point that was also in the letter, I think that Solena referred to, but I think everybody agrees that you cannot just withhold medicine from citizens, no matter where they are, whether they are in Russia or not. you know, we need to ensure that people have access to medicine that they need. And if that's medicine coming from Western countries, I think, yeah, we should try to keep supplying that.
Okay. Wait a second, there is a new question. So this is a question to all. Russia-Ukraine war can impact all worldwide pharma sector, question mark. So can the Russia-Ukraine war impact the entire worldwide pharma sector or just those countries involved? What should pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industries learn about this unexpected invasion/war when looking to the future? Do you think that a risk-based approach should be done looking to all pharma company sites and understanding the risks associated with unaccepted disruptions and the impact of it in business continuity and to patients? It's a big one.
Yeah, maybe I can start, and let's try to answer that together. Of course, one thing what we learn is that that when developing our business continuity plans and discussing this in our meetings with our clients and with our board members, we usually speak about whatever recently pandemics or some other situations, but war or such a disaster as it has just happened, it seems that this was almost out of the fantasy. We were not really, probably no one has believed that this might happen. So I think this is at least one big lessons learned, is that to make sure that we have our business contingency plans and also all the risk management plans in the clinical trials and the clinical projects to be adapted and to be reviewed with such situations in mind. How do we manage? How do we make sure that our staff and our patients and our investigators are safe? So that's a big probably lesson learned moving forward. And maybe just another thought is that this is definitely not going to be a local impact. The whole given that, let's say, talking about clinical trials, the reliance of the recruitment was really big from looking at those countries and at this region. So to make sure, of course, how it's going to be impacting drug registrations, clinical trial further conduction. How do we continue those clinical trials which stopped on the way? How do we resume? Can we still use the data which will be coming from the very already different setting? And what do we do if the records of medical data are being destroyed? So those are initial thoughts. Maybe colleagues can continue.
Yeah, I'm also thinking a little bit more, just reading the question again, that if this conflict will impact worldwide pharma, I'm thinking not so much, maybe. But it makes me think also of, for example, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, where a lot of questions were raised about pharmaceutical ingredients, for example. If we depend on one country where a lot of these ingredients are manufactured and that country is impacted, or we cannot transport these goods, what does it mean? You know, simply it was not medicine, but the face masks in the beginning of COVID, we couldn't get a hold of them because these should all come from China. And that was a difficulty. You could think the same about medicine or even staff. That's what we've also seen in the pandemic, that many companies had a lot of staff in one country, for example, in India. Well, there was a huge wave of COVID at the time, so they were not able to continue their operations simply because the staff was all out. And this is, I think, a lesson learned for, well, I refer to pandemic, but you could say the same about these kinds of crises in our global setup that we are in now. How can we continue our operations? That's a good question that I don't have the answer to, but we should consider.
Okay. Well, unless Selena has anything to add to that, there's another question here for you, Martijn. So if you have to continue your pharmacovigilance activities, do you have some actual practical tips to manage the local staff? Like, how do you continue? Like, more practical tips.
The local staff. And then I'm thinking, well, in any country, because we have, well, let's be honest, we have these challenges. We have the big team in Ukraine, we have a big team in Russia. Let's say until a few months ago, I would not even think about treating anyone differently. And now, as we said in the beginning, our first focus was help our staff in Ukraine, make sure they're safe, etc. And the immediate moment after, thinking like, what do I do with this big important team that we have in Russia? They are people that I work with for a long time. I know them as professionals. I appreciate that. And it's really difficult to switch and at some point think like, should I now consider them as war criminals altogether from one day to another? It sounds so easy if you see Western companies pulling back all their operations from Russia, but I'm working with humans that I know that have families that need an income, who have their own fears. So the truth is, we with our HR are checking in with our Ukrainians every day to see how they're doing. And I manage as good as I can the overall department, also checking in with our Russian colleagues, how they're doing, and keep openly discussing. I'm not going to hide what I think of the aggression in Ukraine. It's clear that Russia invaded and not the other way around. So, and that is the way how I will honestly talk with my people.
Okay. So a question for Selena, apparently. Do you think healthcare professionals in Russia should not be allowed to attend medical trainings sponsored by pharmaceutical companies? Kind of an opinion question.
Really, just my personal opinion. Of course, these we've been in global world 3 weeks ago, but now this world has, how to say, we have two different worlds. So actually, from general perspective, of course, these ties between medical associations in Russia and European, American, or global will be not so, how to say, in some cases they might be interrupted. I've heard something regarding oncology association, but really I'm not sure. Just I've seen.
I think your sound is gone for a minute, Selena.
Yep. I'll stop video just to have better connection.
Now the camera's gone.
Yeah, just to have better
please bear with us for a few seconds.
Okay, just I have very just theoretical assumptions. I do not.
Regina, can you pick up where Sheila?
I think we can hear still Solana. Can't you?
Yep, can you hear me?
Go on. Yeah, go on, Solana.
Just I'll answer briefly. I have just theoretical thoughts that, of course, it will be less trainings provided, sponsored by pharma companies for Russian healthcare professionals. But of course, it depends on each company position, individual position. But nowadays we have online trainings, online meetings, online conferences. I suppose some of trainings might be still continued, but really it's just my theoretical assumptions. I do not have any facts so far.
Okay. So far, actually, I think we are almost near the hour. There are still a few open questions, but to respect everybody's schedules, we're going to answer the remaining questions through email to get back to you, if that is okay. We will keep an open inbox as always, of course. And then, well, thank you for participating in the QA panel. So Martijn van der Leur for pharmacovigilance, Regina for clinical research, and Selena for regulatory. Again, if you have any more questions, feel free to, well, use our email address, leave us a message through the website. We will get back to you. we can imagine there's a lot going on, especially if you have operations in Ukraine or Russia. We're here to help. And that being said, I hope everybody has a great day. And if you have any colleagues in Ukraine, make sure they're safe. Stay safe yourself if you're there. And then we're going to end the webinar here. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.